Thank you. Before I start, I wanted to have a disclaimer. Everything I'm going to say is my view, is not that of my firm. Bhargavi started very well, giving you an overview of what has happened in the financial sector on the regulatory and the legal side in the last couple of years. I want to broaden the canvas a little bit and look at the sort of broader dimensions of financial sector reforms. Bhargavi also touched upon the history of Indian financial services. I have a slightly different view on that, and that view is that we have gone through 3 or 4 paradigms in the way Indian state regulated financial sector. Right until sort of from the independence till 1970, I thought it was the nationalization regime, which means basically the government said, give me a problem, I'll nationalize it. So banks got nationalized, insurance got nationalized, asset management was basically nationalized play through UTI and so on. Then they realized that doesn't quite work. Then came a phase of, give me a problem, I'll give you an institution. So creation of specialized institution, which we created NABARD, we created IDBI, we created SIDBI. So basically, if I see a problem that's something not working, I'll try to create a specialist institution for it, without giving too much of a thinking on what's the model of that institution, how can it become sustainable, and so on. That kind of ran out by about sort of 99, 2000, basically after liberalization. And now it seems to me that the thinking is, give me a problem, I'll give you a regulation. So I will try to, I have regulators, I will use the regulatory power to actually to achieve the sort of the national economic objectives that we might have. And I just feel that that's probably a better way of doing it rather than sort of nationalizing or institutionalizing an issue, but it still has its challenges. And before we really get into, therefore, what the financial sector reforms, it's actually important to recognize how important it is to have a stable, robust, efficient, innovative financial sector for the health of the economy. Banking for the last 40 years has grown at roughly about 1.5 times nominal GDP. If you take last 30, 40 years data. So if the nominal, this is nominal, not real. Nominal GDP grows at 12%, the banking sector roughly grows at about 18. The other way to look at it, that the banking sector has to grow at 18 to support a nominal GDP growth rate of 12. So therefore, if banking goes into trouble, the economy has a problem. In fact, last year, I think the nominal growth in banking was high single digit. And that just tells you that something is not quite right. So it's actually extremely important to have a stable, robust, innovative, efficient financial sector. And then, therefore, how do you create this? And as Bhargavi said, what we have today is not right for a $2 trillion economy. It's certainly not going to be right for a $4 trillion economy, which is what we aspire to be in the next 10 years. So what do you do now to actually construct that sort of a financial sector? I look at 4 dimensions of that reform. The first is what Bhargavi talked about, which is foundational, which is the legal architecture, the laws governing financial sector. Financial sector, you like it or not, will always be regulated. It's so everywhere in the world. And therefore, it needs to have a very strong platform of regulation. Our challenge was that our regulations dated from the British times right until 10 years ago or 5 years ago, which means we had laws that there were probably, during FSLRC time, I discovered that there are over 50 pieces of laws that govern financial sector in India. Some of them older than 100 years. And a lot of them are, almost all of them are poorly drafted. Most of them have anomalies. They are not aligned with each other. So we need a modern, well-drafted, coherent and consistent legal framework, which is what the first part is. But then that's the conception. And as the poet Eliot says, that between the conception and creation is where the stress falls. So we are in that stress area where now we have to sort of create it. And that has to the implementation point that Bhargavi talked about, has 3 elements. There's an element of institutions. Laws always will create institutions, and those institutions have to be designed properly. Typically, institutions are regulators, and we have a lot of them. We keep creating newer ones. But in the design and the functioning of that institution, reforms need to happen. And there are several elements of that. How those regulatory institutions are governed, how the people there are selected, what's the mandate for them, how clear it is. Is it outcome-based, or is it not clear? Very, very importantly now, the capacity at the institutions. One of the challenge I see is that a lot of the regulatory institutions take a long time understanding what's going on before they could even react. And so therefore, how do you ensure capacity building in these institutions? So that's the whole institutional framework, in addition to legal framework, which basically kind of rides on the legal framework, is something that we need to construct. Then there are policies. And I'm distinguishing policies from institutions because policies can get done on an ongoing basis. And it's very important to ensure that the policies are consistent, coherent, and oriented towards the objectives you have. Increasingly, the policy environment is becoming challenging because a lot of the policies have broader implications than you thought. Indian economy is affected by policies elsewhere in the world. There's a famous debate between Dr. Rajan and Ben Bernanke on what the US monetary policy does to India. In fact, he just recently wrote an article which is very interesting where he says, tough luck guys, if that's what happens, you have to deal with it yourself through your own macroprudential policies and so on. So I'm saying there's a policy making apparatus that needs to be created that's efficient, that's objective oriented and so on. The next issue is then governance, which is that both at the institutions as well as in the businesses that run within financial services, we need to ensure proper governance. That's one area again where law can help a lot, but it's also something that you actually put in practice. And I think that's again one area. In India there are very, very peculiar Indian problems, and one interesting problem is that the government is both. Government appoints the regulator, but it's also the regulated because it owns a lot of financial services, 60% of insurance and 70% of banking. So it's interesting that the government appoints the regulators or senior people, and then those regulators regulate the government. This is a very complex, multi-layered agency problem that is very, very hard to resolve. And I think we are going to live with that. So how do you, in this complex setting, ensure highest quality governance, both at the regulators, but also as the institutions that they regulate? That's the next. So these three aspects of governance of financial sector reforms are the ones that have to be paid attention to. That to me is where the implementation of the legal framework that's been created really lies. That's where the implementation challenge is. Effectively, what we have done through numerous committees that Bhargavi listed was sort of broadly created a roadmap. We probably need one last committee to synthesize the work of all the previous committees and then create a roadmap. But I think that's kind of broadly clear now because a lot of them are basically saying the same thing. I think now we need to focus on these other three areas of institutions, policy, and of governance before the benefits of that foundational work can be realized. So I just wanted to give this brief context before we get the panel in. The panel, our panelists are extremely experienced people, lawyers and treasury people, so I'm sure that they will have very, very important things to say on this topic. So I'm going to take a seat and then invite the panelists. We're going to start the conversation then. Thank you.